We are so glad to have Aaron, Rachael, Bret, and Craig. Welcome to Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I love what you guys are doing.
All right, let's get started. So, look, we wanted to bring all of you together. We know all of you. We've all sort of hung out in various different iterations before. And I'm going to be honest with you, as I look on the events of this past weekend, what's happening in Minneapolis, I think a few things are going on through my head, and I really just want to process it with a group of people and a group of people that maybe we don't all think alike on everything, but how do we think about this, And so there's this thing I keep telling myself in my head, which is I think about certain sort of inflection points in our society, right? Whether it's Kent State or it's COVID or it's the Vietnam War or Watergate or whatever. And in my mind, this feels like another inflection point. But I'm wondering if I'm saying that because I'm am I saying that because I'm secretly the most left-wing communist? Or are we actually as a group agreeing that it's an inflection point? And I wonder, Bret, if I can start with you, how are you processing these events, and is this an inflection point for you?
It's very definitely an inflection point, and I would argue it is a terrifying one. But what kind of inflection point it is, I think, is what we are fighting over. And we have to be extremely careful about responding to the optics that come to us through our screens. They are massively deceptive. And if we misunderstand them, if we go with our gut based on the images that we've seen, we are very likely to do tremendous harm to our civilization, which is far from perfect, but I believe it's the best prototype that we have.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that because I think it's, the visual aspect of this is obviously such a key component. Rachael, what do you think about this moment?
I think it's definitely an inflection point. I mean, I think it's the first time in this second Trump presidency when we've seen Republican legislators, speak out against something that the government has done. That alone feels like an inflection point to me. But I have found the events in Minneapolis incredibly troubling and enraging. In some ways, as devastating as they have been and as concerning as they have been, it's also been a really interesting moment where across different constituencies in my sort of online life, in my personal life, people who have varying opinions and for varying perspectives on this, there is a general sense, I think, of unanimous feeling that this is a big deal. Something wrong is going on. We can't go on this way. There have to be changes. That doesn't mean that everybody shares the same idea about what those changes need to be, to Bret's point, but I do think that there's a sense that we've gone over some kind of cliff here and can't continue down this path.
Aaron, do you share that we've gone over a cliff right now and that it feels like a point of no return in some ways?
History's a funny thing because this isn't the first time in the United States that we've seen something like this. I mean, George Washington rode out with the army to quell a rebellion in Kentucky. So this isn't new. It's something that happens often. I mean, and this has gone on over and over throughout the course of history. You can talk about the Civil War. You could talk about different points along the way that have happened in history. So it's hard to always assign every crisis as the moment at which everything is falling apart. But I do think something unique is happening in this moment. And I think we're coming to a place, at least from my perspective, that the thing isn't holding together any longer because we're sort of asking people, we're asking a very large country with 360 million or whatever the number is now to have to cooperate and get along. And to your point, Bret, it's a great system, even though all of it's imperfect and very frustrating. But I think what we're seeing is something where you're forcing folks to have to cooperate in a union that we don't see things the same way. I mean, these sort of glass portals to hell that we hold in our hands oftentimes lead us on paths that we don't necessarily have the full story of, or they're manipulated, or they're clipped up, to give people some kind of sense that it supports their philosophy or agenda or worldview or political ideology. Those things are real. It's challenging to get around that. It's challenging to hold your temper. It's challenging to hold your opinions in a world where everyone has to have an opinion and pronounce everything to align with their ideology within 7 seconds. I think that's a very dangerous world to live in. And so that part of it to me is the inflection point in which we're getting to a point in which we can't cooperate. We're not willing to cooperate. We see facts differently from one another. We don't hold to any sort of center in relationship to what is a true statement, what is scientific, what is empirical, what do we think about certain elements of, the line from the Declaration is so interesting to me that we hold these truths to be self-evident. But who is the we? And are those truths self-evident any longer? And I'm not sure that I can answer that and say yes. So that's sort of how I see it at the moment.
Craig, how are you seeing this moment?
I think in one way it is an inflection point because I spent yesterday talking to a bunch of folks in MAHA trying to figure out what this moment means for their movement and its alignment with MAGA and whether they jump off the bus now or whether they further align themselves to protect themselves in the next election. I spoke to very close people in my family that are the most ardent Second Amendment rights folks you will ever meet. And after watching that video said, those people need to be in prison, which I think is the most profound and unexpected statement that I was expecting to hear. But I also think that maybe this isn't an inflection point, right? Like over the last year, how many of these inflection points do we feel like we've had? And then a week later, there's something else that drowns it out. I see the response to this being so much of the same discourse, which is, well, maybe we just need to pull ICE agents out of Minneapolis and that's will fix it. Or maybe we just need to completely figure out how we retrain ICE agents so that they're not, incapable of handling situations like this. I see very little discussion of like, wait, what are the underlying fundamentals here? ICE is here because of immigration. Why don't we talk about the problems with immigration in this country and actually have a real discussion? Why don't we talk about the incredible backlog that is building up in courts and how we've done nothing to fix that issue? How do we talk about the fact that the US just went into another country and kidnapped its leader and brought them to the United States, and make it no surprise that we have so many people coming to the US as we destabilize the spaces and the places where they live? And if we don't fix those underlying fundamentals, we will continue to find ourselves in this continuing like tumultuous tornado of trying to figure out answers to questions that we're not even asking. And we find ourselves in Minneapolis with this event, doubling down on so much of the past and trying to nibble around the edges as opposed to fixing fundamentally the problems with the system and the way that we're approaching it. So I see it as an inflection point in the way people in my life are seeing this and thinking about this moment. I do not see it as an inflection point in the overall trajectory, not yet at least, of what we're going to do about it.
Rachel, you had a thought.
Yeah, well, I'm just really interested in both Aaron and Bret brought up this concern about the idea that the information that we're all getting in this like sort of bombarding 24/7 live stream of what's going on, that we don't know how reliable that information is, and that, things are clipped and doctored. The White House put out a photo that then they acknowledged was AI doctored, where they changed a woman's face as she was getting arrested. And if we think about when Renee Good was killed, we spent, the days after, the country was incredibly divided about what they saw in that video. And we had video of that incident from multiple angles, and there was a ton of disagreement about what that video showed, even as it was sort of slowed down and, analyzed and whatever. So I think that there's this interesting sort of juxtaposition between the ways in which I think we are all more doubtful than we've sort of ever been about what counts as a fact that we can all agree to be the truth. And at the same time, to Craig's point about talking to the 2A people in his life, for example, there is something about what's gone on in the past week, especially, where even without total agreement about which truths are self-evident, there is some visceral response in which there are some values in common that are coming to the fore. And I don't know that those values are about immigration, Craig. I think those values are more about the role of sort of state violence or tyranny or the presence of law enforcement in people's lives, or where, sort of civil rights end and state control begins, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that there, from sort of lots of different corners in my world, there is a lot of agreement that what we've seen in the past week is not acceptable, even as there's not agreement about what it even is that we're seeing.
Yeah, Bret, do you want to take that?
Yes. I'm afraid I'm about to break this discussion and that there's no choice about it. Hopefully,
Let's fucking do it, Bret.
Yeah, let's do it. I see something very different in this event than it sounds like everyone else in this discussion is seeing. And I will tell you that I am a lifelong liberal. I don't think my values have changed much. I think my political position has changed radically. One of the few places where I have switched sides, I am now very much a supporter of the Second Amendment, which I used to think was the greatest error the founders had made. I now see it almost in the inverse light. But what I very definitely see in Minnesota is a trap that was set up for us that we have now fallen into. And I see the folks on both sides of it. I see the ICE agents and the protesters as pawns in a game in which the objective is to make sure that we cannot understand each other as Americans. You see one of two different things that happened in that event. As a human being who is used to being able to look through your eyes, see events, and evaluate them, what we are seeing is a radical distortion of reality designed to get us to respond from our amygdalas rather than from our centers of reason. And so I will tell you right now, I do not know if the shooting of Alex Pretti was justified. There are features of the event that are still to be resolved on which that legal question rests. It's very clear he did not deserve to die, but that does not mean that some or all of the officers that shot at him were not legally justified in doing what they did. We don't know. It hinges on a question, for example, of the gun that was removed from Alex Pretti either did or did not go off in the hand of the officer that was removing it from the scene. If it did go off, then it is very likely that the officers who were involved in a struggle thought that they were in immediate danger, which would legally justify their shooting. Now, it's possible that that applied to some and not all. It's also possible that they had some discussion before the event that we are not privy to, in which they decided to take a protester out. I've seen no evidence of that. I don't expect to discover such a discussion, but we have to understand that things that are not captured in the video radically alter the interpretation of events. And I will say one thing that I hear mentioned not at all in this discussion is that the Trump administration is always under the accusation of being fascist or authoritarian or Nazi or whatever. And there is now a game afoot to make sure that it behaves in ways that look like that. So the idea of masked officers enforcing the law looks like, well, these people are embarrassed at what they are doing. They don't stand behind their own actions, so they're wearing masks. On the other hand, they're being doxxed. What exactly is the rational response to doing a job that you've been assigned to do and have people attempting to put your home information, the locations of your families, online to be terrorized? I don't know what the rational reaction to that is, but certainly masks is on the list of things one might consider. So I would like us to step back from whatever things we think we have rationally concluded based on what we've seen and understand that the most fundamental thing here is that there is much we don't know and that the interpretation of the events can radically shift over things that are quite plausible.
So, Bret, I'm really fascinated by that because sometimes it can appear that who says that there's not enough information available, can even that feel like a political statement? I guess my question is, why do you feel like there isn't enough evidence out there to at least say, as an American who, even if he was there to protest, that there is a situation that is so tense and so hopped up? And I love that you said that it was set up. I want to explore that with you. Like, who set it up? How are we being set up? That isn't it not fair to say that no one is set up to actually succeed in that moment, and that it actually is fair to say that there are state agents that are being set up to make the worst kinds of mistakes, and that we as American citizens are going to suffer from that?
Well,
Bret?
is exactly what is happening. And from my perspective, we have an absolutely novel situation in which the prior administration opened our southern border, and a huge number of people came into the country violating the law, and we know nothing about them. Now, I grew up in California in the 80s. It was well understood that we had a lot of illegal migrants from Latin America, that they were on balance a positive contributor to the economies of California and to the country. So I'm well familiar with the argument. I'm pro-immigration. I would like us to agree on what level of immigration enhances the country. I would like us to do it honorably. And I would like us to make sure, it seems to me that the top priority in deciding who to let into the country is to make sure that everyone that we let in likes us and wants to be part of this experiment. And we did not do that. Under the Biden administration, the influx of immigrants had no vetting process. We know that people who were hostile to the U.S. came in, and this has been left for the Trump administration to resolve. Now, I see the Trump administration as very poorly wired for this job. It does tend towards a callous, brutalist approach to such things. And so it could be counted on to make errors, and it is now being amped up. The protesters themselves are, I believe, I can say, based on what I have seen and what I have also experienced in the parallel situation in Portland during the BLM riots, where I was there on the ground. I attended the riots. I saw it in person. I talked to Antifa folks, that there is a game afoot, and the game is to induce overreaction, and to document it in order to change the political understanding of the event. In other words, to change the direction of sympathy. That game, in this case, involves creating a radically inhospitable work environment for the ICE officers. Now, I'm not saying that these ICE officers are the right people. I'm not saying they're well trained. I'm not saying that the plan that they're being deployed under is a good one. But I am saying that the job that they must do is not doable. You can't do what they're doing well. It can't be done, right? You have people who are actively trying to keep you amped up with whistles and horns and belligerent behavior and accusations and threats against your family of doxing. This morning, I was shocked to discover a series of videos of medical professionals describing plans to administer medication to these people, to frighten them with syringes. So you have a job that can't be done, and you have people trying to do it. And we are looking for the worst abuses, which will then become absolutely famous. And then we are asked as Americans to evaluate whether the policy is the wrong policy or has gone too far. This is not us trying to figure out how to deal with difficult scenarios and differing over what the right approach is. This is two sides that do not view each other as fellow countrymen trying to induce the other into fatal errors. And the responsibility for that goes to all of the people who created an unresolvable puzzle. That's what we are seeing. The governor of Minnesota is on that list. The Biden administration is on that list. And if we don't start there, I'm not sure what other conversation we can even have. We've been given a puzzle that can't be resolved, and then we are remarking on the fact that it is being resolved poorly.
Rachel, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, because I agree and also disagree, I think, with what Brett just said. So I actually agree completely with the idea that ICE officers, and some of them are CBP officers, right? They're sort of a mix of agencies on the ground, are absolutely, I agree that they are being set up to do an impossible job. And when I think about this, I think a lot about the years that I spent working in jail, which was putting corrections officers just showing up to do the work that they were, that's their job in incredibly dangerous environments where they're incredibly under-resourced, where the physical plant that they're in is horrific, where people are in states of extreme desperation and deprivation, and in settings that are sort of defined by violence. And then you say to those people, control this setting, make people follow a million rules, and don't let anything get out of hand, and maintain complete self-composure at all times. I completely agree that that sets people up sort of regardless of training to some extent. But certainly in circumstances where, as we know, many of these ICE officers are relatively new, right? That you're putting them in circumstances that they absolutely are not prepared to manage. So I agree with that completely. I think the place where I differ, Brett, is, to me, the people who have sort of created that dynamic are the ones who surged so many officers into Minneapolis to begin with. There are currently, the current federal agent to local law enforcement ratio is 3 to 1. There are more ICE and CBP people around sort of walking the streets than there are local police officers. And the ways in which internal enforcement is being practiced currently is incredibly confrontational. So we've seen, and we can debate, I guess, the sort of reliability of these images, but we've seen, a fair number of images of ICE officers being particularly violent in the ways in which they are capturing people. We've seen family separation. There was an amazing piece in the Free Press this week by Karen McKean, a writer in West Texas, who wrote about a Venezuelan family where the mother had been separated from her children. This pastor in Texas, a Trump voter, had taken these kids in. Just really, really excruciating sort of humanitarian stories. And also stories of sort of like a fundamental government incompetency in critical moments, right? Where like they sent this mother away and didn't know where her kids were. We are seeing people, take American citizens into immigration detention. We're seeing them knock down doors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that I share your perspective that those officers have been set up to do an impossible task and empowered to do it in a way that is violent and also, frankly, very sloppy, out of sort of a desperation to meet quotas, to create, this performance that I think we're all identifying. From my experience in jail and now, for me, the onus is on the state, which has a particular monopoly over the exercise of violence, to be deliberate, to be restrained. And the lack of sort of deliberation and restraint here feels to me like the fundamental provocation. Not saying that there weren't significant errors during the Biden administration around how immigration was managed, but in terms of the actual enforcement questions in Minneapolis, for me, the responsibility lies with the administration first.
Brett, I want to get your response to that, but before we go to Craig and to Aaron, because I do want to just focus in on the idea that what is the original sin, right? I think that's what we're sort of getting at. Is it the larger broken immigration policy, or is there something specific about the Trump administration that perceiving, blue cities as being these places where illegal immigration has gone rampant, therefore justifying a surge of effectively hostile agents of the state? Do you think it's important to identify that original sin and just respond to Rachael?
Yeah, well, I would put the original sin at the declaration of sanctuary cities. That the idea that federal immigration policy is going to be overridden by states or municipalities is in and of itself frightening. We as Americans have a right to set an immigration policy. What the Biden administration did opening the border was unprecedented. They effectively surrendered our right to regulate immigration, which, among other things, puts legal immigrants at a massive disadvantage. People who decided they did want to abide by our laws were foolish because they could have just walked across the border and then been transported into the interior by the Biden administration. So we created an insane policy that was not envisioned by our founders. And the fact that there are places in the interior that have decided to aid and abet that policy, and in fact had set up that expectation decades earlier, it means that we have a misunderstanding of ourselves as a nation. Now, I'm not sure that I agree with Rachael about the overwhelming numbers of ICE agents. My feeling, thank goodness I am not in the position that I have to figure out how to address the immigration crisis, because I'll tell you right now, I don't think it is solvable in a reasonable way. But if I were to try to advance a plan, I would say that in light of the intense resistance on the ground, I would want enough officers that the officers did not feel jeopardy, right? I would want to minimize their jeopardy to reduce the chances of an error. And so I'm not sure that that's a mistake at all. But I also, we can talk about the tragic cases of families being broken apart, losing track of parents and children. These things are absolutely horrifying. I mean, I'm the parent of 2 children. I'm also a biologist who has spent a good deal of time thinking about the unique relationship of human parents to their offspring. And the idea of breaking families apart in this process strikes me as horrifying. But you certainly can't zoom in on a particular case and diagnose this particular administration if you're not at least willing to go and look at past administrations and ask how they did on the same question. And if you look at the Obama administration, for example, you'll find many such errors. So again, I think the people on the ground are pawns. That applies to the ICE officers. It applies to the protesters. They are playing out a role that is designed to create an unresolvable conflict. But we are also pawns. The ultimate objective of this is to shift public opinion, and that public opinion will shift based on the fact that it is irresistible to interpret what we've seen on our screens and reach a judgment about it. That's what we do. That's the kind of creature we are. And to understand that the individual edits that we are seeing are inherently misleading, and that the purpose is to mislead us, and 2 factions are trying to mislead us in opposite directions, that's just the baseline for even beginning to analyze this puzzle.
But is the ultimate objective here of this ICE operation to manipulate us, and both sides, as you argue, are attempting to manipulate us, or is the ultimate goal here to mitigate an immigration crisis in Minneapolis? Like, do we believe the Trump administration's goal is actually, through this operation, to mitigate a crisis among undocumented immigrants in Minneapolis?
It's a little hard to say, and I'm not even convinced that the administration is of one mind. But I will say, as part of the effort to put these people in office, that the immigration crisis created by the Biden administration was top of mind for many of the people who came together to elect Trump. And the idea, I mean, many people I have heard suggest that the right thing to do is just to leave Minneapolis out of it. Just why go there if this is going to be a flashpoint? You're obviously looking to be violent if you're stepping into this realm. But I find that preposterous. We can't allow those who want to make immigration enforcement impossible or lethal set immigration policy for the country. We can't incentivize the disruption of this activity, and the activity has to be done. So again, I see the Trump administration as damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they walk out of Minneapolis, they are explaining exactly how it is if you want to violate the national immigration policy, how you do it. And if they go in, they are going to be confronted with a completely hostile work environment in which errors are going to happen and be documented.
Bret, now I'm going to break the conversation up. Here's the thing that I'm like having a little trouble with as I hear you making a really rational case for like how we should be logically looking at this. If we're students of history and we look at episodes where like a singular figure something happens to, like the person in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square, or the 4 people that got killed at Kent State, or like those things happen and they blow the lid off. I feel like it's not fair to make this about Renee Good and Pretti, and in terms of, well, they're only just 2 individuals. Aren't they emblematic? And we should give them the respect of being emblematic of a real problem with a forceful state here. I agree with you on some level that this is about a larger conversation about immigration, but like when somebody fucks up in that moment, we gotta call it what it is. We did it during Kent State. We did it during Tiananmen Square. Like, we can't just make this about, well, Biden started it. Bret?
Oh, I'm not saying that at all. And I will tell you, I'm very uncomfortable with what I see in the ICE enforcement, but I'm skeptical about whether or not I have the view from 30,000 feet. I believe I have the view from like 3 feet. And all I can say is, if those officers reasonably feared for their lives in the instant that they chose to shoot, then that tells us where we are legally. If they did not, that also tells us. I'm not telling you I know the answer to that question, but I do know enough about that landscape to say there are certain facts that we must pay attention to. Did, this person, Alex Pretti, chose to take a particular weapon into that environment. Now, I need to know whether or not he was going there to protest or he was carrying a concealed weapon and happened onto the protest. Now, it doesn't make him guilty of anything if he went to the protest with that weapon, but it does make him reckless. The idea of going into a contentious environment where confrontations with armed officers are expected with a loaded weapon, further, to involve himself in a physical conflict in which I believe the officer who shoved the woman that he then stood up for was engaged in reckless behavior, probably criminal behavior, probably an assault. But for a person to go into such a scenario with a loaded weapon and then engage in what was already a physical conflict by stepping in on behalf of the woman who was shoved also suggests recklessness. Finally, I am not saying that we know that he had a bullet in the chamber. But if his weapon went off as it was being removed from the scene, then I believe that means he must have had a bullet in the chamber. Now, I'm not expecting others to want to care about the details of his particular decision-making process in his carrying of a concealed weapon. But I will tell you, that weapon with a bullet in the chamber carried into an environment where conflict with armed officers is expected is reckless in the extreme. Again, I'm not saying that he did that. It's possible he was armed for other reasons, that he walked into a protest he did not expect, that he responded viscerally to this woman being shoved and did not have his mind on the fact that he was armed in this way, and it is possible that he did not have a bullet in the chamber. But the gun he was carrying does not, as I understand it, have a safety. To have a bullet in the chamber means you are depending on absolutely everything going right. And even touching the trigger in the removal of that weapon from the holster is likely to set it off. So recklessness does not justify your being killed, but what I'm saying is there are details here that we in the public do not yet know, and yet we in the public are rushing to judgment about what the event was and what it therefore means. And I don't think we know.
Brett, I think that you're hitting on a point that everybody's asking in the nation now, like what happened and, what is going to be discovered in an investigation. But Craig, you wanted to jump in with a few comments.
Yeah, I have a couple quick things to say to try to maybe pull some of the last comments together, and then I'd love to hear what Aaron has to say about this. We just spent the last, I don't know, 5-10 minutes talking about the granular facts of one case, but let's go back and talk about granular facts of the other. And even if we all saw the videos of Renee Good, and we can argue about, whether it was justified or not, under pressure, under threat, I think that's missing, to your point, Brett, that's missing the most important part of the discussion. We're creating different truths. There's one singular truth for me here as an ER doctor. It has been reported that for 8 minutes after she was shot, she had a pulse. The ICE agents, who ostensibly are trained in CPR, did not perform CPR. That is murder. Regardless of standing in front of the car, on the side of the car, I don't care. I want the discussion to be about facts like that I think are unequivocal. I think we can all agree here, regardless of whether we believe that her shooting had any justification at all, that an ICE agent who is trained in CPR stood by for 8 minutes after they shot someone and did not perform CPR. That is murder. That is
Can we let's use this as an exercise. I've never heard that claim, but I will absolutely tell you that if that claim is accurate, it is highly relevant to the shooting in question. From my perspective, it is unforgivable not to have administered all relevant aid in that circumstance. And if that's true, I don't know. I would have to look into the legal question whether it's technically murder, but it probably is.
There was also a doctor. There was also a doctor who asked permission to approach, to provide medical care. Who was told not to.
Are we talking about the Renee Good shooting?
Talking about Renee Good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I think that reveals some fundamental truths about a couple of things here. One, regardless of whether it's legally murder, I think morally it's murder. And ultimately, this goes to the problem of what is the underlying intent. And Brad,
let's use it as an exercise. Yeah,
Hold on, just 1 second. Let me just talk through this, because you mentioned something earlier about Biden administration and Obama and the Trump administration and all being set up to fail. And let me just do one thing and speak for the side that probably feels a bit different on immigration. There's no one that's like, I want open borders. I want everyone to come in and have a party. I think we all agree in some sense that there needs to be some type of restrictions. But I do want to point out that there's a difference in the underlying intent between what we saw in the Biden administration, and I'm not going to stand up and be the defender of all immigration policy of the Biden administration. Similarly, with the Trump administration, we have rules. We have conventions. In 1951 and 1967, the United States signed on to these refugee protocols. We signed on. We agreed to them. And we said that people coming to our borders have the right to claim asylum. And that's what we did. I don't think it was done well. But what I see right now, and what I see in these ICE officers that are untrained, we hear reports of people, signing up after a 6-minute interview to get a $50,000 bonus. I think that sets us all up to fail, them included, including people that are being shot. But the concern for me is not necessarily whether we respect 1967 protocols that we agreed on 5 or 7 presidents ago. So what is the underlying intent of what is happening right now? And if you look at social media coming out of the White House, if you listen to the statements being made by Stephen Miller, this is a copy-paste of the language of eugenics from 100 years ago. Craig, that's excessive. You're being hyperbolic. White Afrikaners from South Africa. Discussion about making refugee exemptions for folks from the ADF in Germany. This is bananas. We saw this 100 years ago. We saw the language, and they're not even being subtle about it, right? Go look at the Homeland Security's webpage. Go to their Twitter feed. They're using the exact same font and script of the Nazi regime. They're tooling with us, and they're toying with us, and I think it's disgusting. And so I cannot, in good faith, sit and listen. Quite frankly, I'm sure that there are ICE agents that are trying to do their job and like out there, but like the underlying intent of this administration has been made clear. They look at these communities as not human. And I, as someone who has spent my whole career defending human rights, not just abroad, but here in this country, am disgusted. And so I look at that underlying intent and I can't feel like anything built on such morally questionable grounds can be justifiable towards the top. With that,
Well, thank you so much for that, Craig. Let me get a response from Bret, and then I want to bring Aaron in. Bret, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. First of all, I would suggest, I think this is a good discussion so far. I've learned things. I would like to figure out if we can compile a list of things on which we agree. For example,
My man, that is like, yes,
love it, Bret.
go.
I agree that if Renee Good was denied medical care at a point at which it was not certain that it would fail, in other words, if the possibility of rescuing her existed and it was not done, that it is, I will say, tantamount to murder. I don't know the legal question, but I will say tantamount to it, that it radically alters the analysis of that shooting. I am stunned by the claim that the Trump administration is seemingly deliberately using recognizable fonts and language of Nazis. I'd love an example so that we can evaluate what it is. I have no doubt that the Trump administration is playing with us, and that is one of the things that Trump does is he plays on tropes. He turns accusations that are leveled at him around. I don't like it stylistically, but he has proved himself to be a master of a game that most of us don't really understand, a political game that has put him in office. So I would be interested in knowing what it is that that he said. But I would also like to know if everyone else here agrees that in the Alex Pretti shooting, that if his gun went off, that potentially explains why officers would have shot him, that legally it might justify that shooting in the sense that they would have a right to shoot if they believed that there was an immediate threat to their lives in that moment. It doesn't have to be accurate. If somebody had set off a firecracker, it could still have put them in the frame of mind that they believed that they were entitled to shoot him based on an immediate threat to their persons. Do we all agree that if Alex Pretti's gun went off accidentally as it was being carried away, that changes our understanding of the actions of the officers who shot him?
I would just add, was he not laying on his stomach with his hands by his head at that moment? And would that be factored into, I take your point about his gun going off, which creates this environment of threat, of life and death threat for officers. But if they visually see him with his hands not on a gun, would they not have to do everything possible? Is it not in their code to do everything possible to avoid lethal force, as in lay on top of his hands and start to handcuff him?
I'll agree with you right there. If he had his hands on his head and he was lying flat on the ground, then whatever
sound
fear
happens,
they may have had was not about him. If they could see, any officer that could see his hands, both of them at that moment, would know he wasn't shooting. So shooting him is not a sensible response. I'll grant you that. Now, I don't think his hands were on his head. I don't think he was lying flat on the ground at that instant. But if he was, that changes it for me.
But there were also, the majority of the shots were fired after he was lying on the ground. The gun had been removed. There were a total of 10 shots fired. So even if that one shot that you're talking about is in question, presumably what killed him, and we don't know for sure, were the many shots after he was lying on the ground.
I get the sense from Bret. I think what you're asking of us is, if even in the fog of like holy shit, what's going on? There's a lot of stuff going on. A gun goes off. Is it not, in fact, predictable and even like you would expect that these ICE officers would then, I guess the one thing I would say to that, yes, I mean, sure, if I put myself in the body and the mind of an ICE agent and I'm already kind of amped up and hopped up and there's a tense situation and a gun goes off, I guess there's the other point of this is the training, right? The other point of this is that we live in a country where there's a Second Amendment and there's concealed carry and there's which you just said that you will fight tooth and nail to protect, right? But ultimately, if you're going to have concealed carry laws and you're going to have a Second Amendment to protect people having guns, doesn't that need to then go all the way up to whoever is in a situation of responding to know that that could even happen? And to sort of say that it's this guy's, like, I don't know, I guess my point is I can like if you're trying to get to just the most basic, like one gun goes off, so therefore another gun could go off. Yes, I agree that scenario, I think that's what you're trying to get us to just agree on, just that particular scenario. And I will say to you, Bret, I could see that happening, that in a scenario where everyone's amped up, a gun could go off. But that, to me, I still expect better of law enforcement agents, is I think where I come from.
Can I just very briefly say, because I think, Bret, what you're trying to do is say there are things that we do agree on. And I know so much of what I hope we talk about is trying to move forward when there are things we don't agree on or don't think we agree on, or when we have different data. But what you're trying to say is, can we agree on this much? I can tell you, as someone that has been in multiple places and in multiple events where I've been shot at, that I think it's plausible and completely understand. I think I don't know if it's understandable. I think it's undoubtedly possible that what happened could transpire. I think, to Brenda's point, like, this is the value of training. Like, that is why I was sent to go work in a civil conflict in Burundi. That was why I was sent to go work on board a search and rescue boat in the middle of the Mediterranean, because I was trained that when there was shooting, I knew to tell everybody to get down behind the wall so that the shots couldn't come through, or to tell everyone on the boat to get down so that when the Libyan Coast Guard was shooting at refugees or migrants in the water, they wouldn't be struck. And so I'm willing to concede that much, that it's certainly plausible. I don't know about the legal aspect. I think the other thing was that legal, I don't know, quite frankly, whether that's true, but thank you for trying to find some common ground on this.
Well, let me just say,
Rachael,
I do not want, I can tell you that the idea that something may have happened that caused the first officer who shot to believe that there was an imminent threat to his life does not justify every following shot. And so what I would like to see done is a moment-by-moment analysis of what took place, because I think, from other events, there is a tendency, once a shot has been fired, that effectively somehow alleviates responsibility from others who then go on to shoot, even though they might well not perceive a threat at that point. I mean, what I see in the video is Alex Pretti being hit and immediately becoming limp and falling to the ground. So I'm not arguing that I even think that this was a justified shooting over its entirety, but I do think it is incumbent on us to be very careful where it is that we say a line has been crossed and on the basis of what evidence, because at the end of the day, that is the question.
Yeah, Bret, I think
we have these standards.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think in the spirit of, if we're going to turn this conversation into, let's find some things that we can agree on, something you said in the beginning, I'm hanging on a little bit. You said that, you know, what we're seeing on our screens is massively deceptive. And I think that's another part that it's difficult to agree on, and difficult for people to wrap their head around, because, you know, I think the inflection point discussion that we started here is that we all saw what we saw and then heard narratives that contradicted us. That contradicted what we saw. And it is important, and I think we are trying to do that here, that we all know that there's an investigation that should be conducted. But as a society, and the reason why we're sitting here having this conversation, and the reason why police are on the scene, and the reason why there's news coverage, and the reason why everything happens, is because we do need to discern truth in real time. We do not always have, this luxury of, a full dissection. We should do that before we, cast blame and, do all these things. But we do need to, as a society, figure out how do we discern truth in real time. And I think the reason why this is an inflection, again, is because of the video. And we all saw something, but then heard administration officials describe something differently. But Aaron, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, well, okay, so a couple things. There's lots that run through my head, but I mean, the Boston Massacre was British regulars who were acquitted by John Adams in a trial based upon a very similar circumstance, to be honest. I mean, there's reality to some of those conversations about what happens when somebody's in duress and how do we handle those things and what do we do about them. So this is a human characteristic. I think part of what I would love to talk about and try to bring to some perspective is the idea that all of this is the only outcome that government has, or the state, let's call it the state. The only outcome that the state has in the situation it is in is to use force. And it started by the use of force as well. If the government was large enough to allow a mass amount of migration to happen, to place it, to give people money and transportation and all of these sorts of things, the ability to go to these places, that's a large government that has unlimited disposal of funds, unlimited disposal of resources, and they sort of have created this. And I'm not necessarily laying this entirely at the Biden administration, because this has been going on since the 80s. It's been going on before that. And to your point, Craig, I think that some people, we have signed on to some agreements that I don't necessarily think are healthy or good or beneficial to our country. They may have made sense in 1967 or 1951. They don't necessarily make sense in today's environment. But you have a government that has a lot of capabilities at force. We watched it in COVID. We watched it in all of these other places that are kind of historically happening, even within our lifetime, whether that's 9/11 and some of the other things that happened with war. We have a government so large that and with so much force at its disposal that the only way to get back to anything is more use of force. And so Minneapolis is a good example of this. You have people that were placed there over the last 25 years by the force of government, and now their only recourse is to use more force. And I guess I'd like to ask the group here, how do we get out of a conversation about, are we having the right conversation about what we are as a country? Are we having a right discussion about what is it that we are? The Constitution that we have, it was really designed for 13 colonies as a compact of states that agreed together to do mutual things together for the betterment of the whole. What we see now is something entirely different. I mean, we can debate about all of the different conversations around that, but prior to the Civil War, people said the United States are, which is the grammatical correct version of that, which is a compact of states, small republics that decided to come together and do things. After the Civil War, we say the United States is, because it's a monolith, it's a centralized government with lots of power and lots of authority. Aristotle in Poetics says over and over that there are some key components to having a republic. In the ancient Greece, there were 1,500 republics, all sized around 10,000 units of people per republic. The largest one was Athens at 100,000. Greece is the size of Alabama. So you have much more representation, much more conversation around how are we represented? What do we think about how to govern ourselves? We have 435 people making decisions about how the United States works, and if you add senators, another 100. That's a small number of people. That's 1 per 750,000 people in the United States is being represented, and that to me is where most of this is frustration. You have a government with unlimited power and absolutely no voice in that, and that's what the frustration has been for me. Whether that was in COVID, that's this situation. Over and over again, I find myself frustrated at the size, scope, and power of government, and their only option is to resort to force.
Rachael, Bedard, any reaction to that?
Just that I really like what you said, Aaron, because I agree. I think that these are sort of fundamentally democracy problems. And I think that they are problems of living that reflect that we live in a huge pluralistic democracy that is governed with structures that have not updated to reflect the reality of what this country is. And that we often talk about where the tensions are in a way that I think sort of misleads us about what's challenging. So, for example, for me, there is this sort of pervasive tension or this common thread tension through lots of the things that I think we have some disagreement about on this call about what the government's role is in negotiating between personal liberty and bodily autonomy and collective safety and order. And we're seeing that play out in Minneapolis and around use of force. We're seeing it play out around immigration. But I think that when we talk about, is this similar to COVID in any way? To me, it's similar in terms of what is the role of the government in trying to exert policy that tells people how to conduct themselves in their personal lives and their personal choices. I do think that for me, pluralism is an incredibly foundational value. Like, I want to live in a diverse society where people disagree with one another. And I want to live in a country that accommodates that disagreement in a way that does not escalate into force. And so it feels essential to me that we sort of find a way out of this that isn't, as you're describing right now, sort of the inevitability is like we have nowhere to go but towards violence. I'd like to figure out how to not just de-escalate from violence, but come to a place of productive decision making that doesn't require agreement, because I don't think that that's actually what we're going for. I don't think we're looking for consensus in which we all have to agree on something. I think we're looking for ways in which to navigate lack of consensus in a context where that's to be expected and I think celebrated.
Bret, you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I do. First of all, I resonate with it strongly, but I want to add a couple things to it that I think make it more likely we can get there. One is I don't expect us to agree as a nation very frequently. Sometimes something is that clear, but often it isn't. But I want us to separate disagreement over policy from disagreement over values. I believe it is essential that we agree at a values level to what we as Americans stand for, what we want to see, and that is possible. So we can agree, for example, that we want a highly educated public. We can disagree about whether the way to do that is through a massive state program or by privatizing things and allowing the market to sort it out, right? Those are opposite proposals, but everybody should agree that an educated public is better than an uneducated one. But I also wanted to zoom out a little bit and explain why we are having trouble even with that basic step of agreeing on values that I think should be intuitive for the most part. And it does involve the recognition that something powerful is not actually on board with America functioning. And I think we can establish that this must be the case with the recognition of the following thing. We have two major parties in our country. Both of them betray the public more often than not. In fact, I would argue almost always. Almost all policy is being driven by some small interest or private interest or foreign interest. And it is rare that a policy comes to the fore that's obviously just good for people. Now, the reason that that's important is because it's so unlikely. We live in a democratic republic, and any party that simply decided to do the bidding of the public, even cynically, even a party that just wanted to win, and it decided that the way to get the public to be sympathetic with it was to just do their bidding, that party would be unbeatable. So why doesn't it exist? If you could win American elections by simply advocating for the interests of the public and win, then somebody should be doing it. And it doesn't happen. In other words, it is forbidden in our system, effectively. You cannot escape our two deeply corrupt parties. And What that means is that as the public begins to wise up to that game, that something has to step in so that we don't recognize that what unites us far exceeds what divides us, an obvious fact, I would say. Something has to step in and make us unrecognizable to each other. We have to fight over something profound, and whether it's COVID shots or immigration enforcement or abortion, whatever it is, something has to rise at that moment so that we will be divided and the corrupt structure that we have can march on undaunted. That's where I think we are, and I think we are living an instance of that. We are supposed to be looking at something on our screens that we cannot come to agreement over, and I very much appreciate that in this conversation we're beating the odds in that regard.
Me too. Aaron, you had a thought.
Yeah, I completely agree with Bret, honestly. I think that's a huge portion of this. And having been involved in the Kennedy campaign, that was just practically, there was no voice. There was no opportunity, and every chance that if there was ever any traction, it didn't go anywhere, because even though there were practical things and pragmatic things that he was saying, and again, I know a lot of folks focus on his health stuff, which is a critical component of his success. But I was fascinated by his campaign for a multitude of reasons beyond the health conversations, because I thought he had better answers than the two parties. They were practical solutions about the border. They were practical solutions about money. They were practical solutions about how we see one another and how do we interact with each other. That was attractive to me. He had no traction and had absolutely no shot at winning the presidency, because I think, as Bret suggests, it's easy to allow some interests to control a very powerful government. If you only have to buy off 430, and really you only have to buy off 200 some people, that's a very cheap expense for interested parties. That's not a massive thing. And secondarily to that, the underlying structure of the government is bureaucratic. That is the backbone of the entire system, and that system is unbreakable. You've seen it a number of times where people have tried or made attempts at it, and they've all promised, whether that was Trump or Reagan or Nixon or Kennedy, JFK, you saw people saying that they wanted to break the infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't break, and the consequences are that the government continues to march in a singular direction, which is towards an empire. And I just feel very convicted that this is a conversation that if we could turn our ire to the right direction, which is that particular system, that backbone, that underlying structure, we would have a lot more progress about the things we agree about in this country than these fights over silly little things. It was one of my favorite lines in the campaign, which was Kennedy would say, well, the king and the queen come to the side of the castle and they look amongst the people, and if they can get the people with the torches and the pitchforks to fight one another, they're welcome to go back inside, pop their champagne, and know that they are safe, because there's never going to be any directive at the people who have caused the trouble. And we do this over and over again. We ask and beg the people in Washington to fix the problems that they created, which is like, I don't know. I wouldn't ask my children to change his own diaper at some point. It's just a really complicated thing. I wouldn't do it. And we're asking something to happen that can't happen, to many people's points on this call. The task is impossible. And we've also done it within a system that perpetuates the impossibility. And I completely agree that there is something more at force here and more at play than simply just red teams and blue teams. This is a mercantilist system. It's a system in which you play to play, and those that have the money can continue to play very well.
But is this something that we feel like the founding fathers kind of screwed up, or was there a time when it worked? I mean, there's a part of me, look, again, call me like the most liberal, whatever, but I look back at FDR and I look back at LBJ and I look at some of these projects that we've engaged in as a society, and I guess maybe I don't take as sort of as dystopian a view of the possibility of government to provide value for the people. And we could maybe, nibble around the edges of like what specific ways in which maybe those were, I mean, shit, when I read some history about FDR, like it was kind of a tyrannical way that he pushed the New Deal forward, let's be honest, But at the same time, I guess there's a part of me that feels like we do have so many examples, Bret and Aaron, of where the people have been sort of provided for, at least as like a project, as like a commitment that the government is going to make to sort of, provide universal health care for people over the age of 65, or put people back to work after the war or after the Depression. And like, it just feels like there was a vision around some of those goals. Am I being too naive in how I describe that, Bret? And then I want to bring Rachael in.
No, I don't think you're being naive at all. And I will just say, for those who don't know me, that I am a lifelong liberal. I'm still proud to hold those values.
We're going to get you back.
Oh, really?
We're going to bring you back into the fold.
Wait till you hear the next part before you decide you want to. So I'm a believer that good governance is essential, that there are game theory problems that can be solved through good governance that can't be addressed any other way, and that a functioning civilization absolutely requires this. However, I'm also 56 years old, and I have watched our government go malignant. And I believe that what we are living in is that most people who are alive and evaluating the situation have only lived under malignant governance. And so they are having a reaction as if governance is malignant inherently, which it can't be. It did work better before. Did it ever work the way the brochure describes it? No, it didn't. There have always been horrors and embarrassments and overreach. And frankly, if there's one thing I could get through to liberals that they need to understand, it's that you can have a very excellent plan for solving a problem, but you're intervening in a complex system. And when you intervene in a complex system, it's literally unpredictable what will happen. The likelihood that there are unintended consequences is 100%. So you have to monitor whether or not the policy that you instituted did the thing that you wanted it to do, and what else did it do, and what was the net impact. And so we do have to get back to a place where we talk about how we are to be governed. And the prerequisite step is coming to recognize each other as fellows. So at some level, the most horrifying thing that we're watching in Minnesota is that we are all becoming aligned with either the masked guys, with their firearms, or the protesters with their whistles. And once you've signed up for those two teams, once we've divided over them, it's game over. Our enemies win.
Craig, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, there's so much to reflect on there. I want to go back to your analogy, Aaron, about the people inside the castle walls, because I think that's really fascinating. And, just hearing you a second ago, Bret, say, and I'll, maybe horribly misquote it, but in complex systems, the likelihood of unintended consequences is 100%. And you just spoke about the fact that we are living in what seems to be this, multipolar, maybe even bipolar set of, I want to say democracy, but in government. And I wonder what for you the cognates are when we talk about truth and we talk about science. And we talk about living in this moment of, like, you can call it a post-normal science where there is no unified truth, where despite what, quite frankly, a lot of my colleagues in medicine and public health believe is that, if only we debunk and pre-bunk and put out the explainers beforehand, we'll get everyone on board, and we can just go back to this wonderful golden era a couple decades ago when institutions and expertise were seen as like the exemplars and the holders of knowledge. That's not happening. That's not coming back. But we're also not well prepared for that future. For you both, folks that have been incredibly vocal over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly on COVID, particularly on government, public health, knowing that the likelihood of unintended consequences is 100% when we're making these decisions, what do you see as the similarities here? Or what do you see as the solutions? If we have a government that is cut, where we have folks that are incentivized to fight amongst themselves, but we live in an environment where we can't even agree on what like truth actually is, where one party or one group will insist on expertise and institutions, and the other group can recognize that the likelihood of unintended consequences is 100%, but have a different understanding perhaps of what like truth and science. Like, what does that even mean for us going forward? And what is the contribution of us working together and trying to understand these different layers and different possibilities of truth? Is that some part of this exercise in trying to build a healthy, pluralistic, or participatory democracy?
Can I just add to that, which is, Brett, I really liked your distinction between policy and values. I think that's really sharp and really correct. And I also liked your exercise about, can we figure out something, what's the list of things we all agree on? And so building on Craig's question, I think a question that I have as we're talking about this, where there's tons that we obviously disagree on. I'm very interested in whether there's a list of values that we might agree on as being held in common with folks here. For example, without having to talk specifically about numbers, I think we all agree that family separation is bad. And I think we think it's bad because we think it's bad to separate kids from their parents. And I think we could sort of try to articulate with values that brings up for us. I'm very interested less in sort of coming up with the list of truths we agree on or facts that we agree on, and I'm really interested in thinking about what the values are that we agree on.
Bret, what's your take on all this?
Yes. Well, this conversation is making me very hopeful. So anyway, thank you all for that.
Me too.
First thing I would say is I got good news for you and I got bad news for you in response to Craig's question. I believe we have demonstrated that good governance is possible, that it is very difficult, but that the trick is to get yourself onto that foothill and then empirically climb the hill, figure out what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, improve the stuff that needs to be improved. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Climbing the hill isn't that hard. The trick is getting to the foothill in question. That's the good news. The bad news is it's a 3-generation problem. What we've got are institutions that are so corrupt, and the people who staff them are in general so cowardly that there isn't enough material to make good governance work. You need to start a process of selection that favors those who are good at the things that make good governance work. In other words, I would say, look, I hate to be the guy who says super extreme things, but we're living in a super extreme era. I believe this is a dark age. Our scientific institutions do not work. They manifestly tell us things that are not true with a level of certainty that is preposterous. So what do you do about that? Well, what you do is you start looking at what doesn't behave that way. Who has a model that successfully predicts things about the future, about the implications of a remedy or an intervention, and irrespective of who those people are or what degrees they have, you start paying attention in proportion to the fact that their model proves out over time, no matter how ridiculous it may sound when they state it at first. If we do that, we can start moving in the direction of functioning scientific institutions and good governance right away. But we are not going to live to see that project completed, which is all right. It's the only game in town is to move in that direction. And then with respect to what Rachael is asking, I actually think this is far easier than you would think. Once you separate out the policy questions, which are truly difficult, from the values questions, we can start listing the values that we agree on very easily. And to the extent that we may find initial disagreement, the discussion that gets us into alignment isn't tough either. So, I started listing as soon as she said that. Consent of the governed, right? That is the sole basis of legitimacy of governance. Equal protection under the law. Shouldn't matter what your skin color is, your nose shape, the book you adhere to, those things don't matter. Informed consent in medicine. We understood in 1947 how important this was. We've completely lost track of it. I would argue that subsidiary to informed consent, if you have a public health intervention that you would like the public to adhere to, public health is entitled to one and only one tool, and that is persuasion. It's not allowed to lie. Noble lies are not tolerable. It's not allowed to coerce and strong arm. It must persuade us. And if it does, you will find people complying, as we do with, the idea of hand washing, for example. The fact is we are persuadable, but if you try to strong arm us, we're going to rebel. So anyway, you could continue that list of values that I just listed, and probably in a half an hour, we could have a pretty good, first draft.
I find that so interesting. Do you think going to, let's talk about COVID for a second, all right? Because, that was a thing. I want to quote something, Bret. I think you'd said this on maybe Tucker or something recently, not even all that long ago, which is, I think you said something to the effect, and to be fair, in the context of this conversation, you were talking about the WHO and some agreement or we had signed or whatever. And you had said, I think it's fair to say that we're in the middle of a coup. We are actually facing the elimination of our national and our personal sovereignty. And you also talked about, that the COVID pandemic caused us to become aware of a lot of structures that have been built around us, and you quoted somebody as calling it a turnkey totalitarian state, that it had not been activated. And then once it's built, the key gets turned. And I guess I think what's really interesting, if you juxtapose what's happening in Minneapolis with the COVID era and this notion of tyranny, which was something that, quite frankly, so many people come on our show, and talk about that period of time being, feeling tyrannical in some ways. Is it not, therefore, the corollary, if you were to believe that the government overstepped during COVID and that we don't necessarily even need to know all the little, we don't even care if they were coming at it from a good place or if they were genuinely doctors who were trying to save lives, because that is, I'll be frank with you, when we have MAHA supporters on and stuff, I don't hear a lot of, I really understood where they were coming from and they were good people. Aaron says that, but the point is that the sort of care with which you're asking us to look at the Minneapolis situation, do we feel like that is the same care with which we looked at COVID when we called it medical tyranny? Bret.
That's a great question. I think I did. And I think I'll just say, look, almost everybody during COVID was doing what they thought their job was. I believe there were some people at the very top who knew a whole lot more than the rest of us who were cynical. But most of the people throughout government, throughout medicine, throughout the world of those of us who discuss these things, were trying to do the right thing. And then the game theory kicked in, and people who should have known better kept doing what they had been doing rather than admit they had taken a wrong turn. And so things did get ugly in the end. And my sense of compassion and generosity towards the people who were deploying the tyranny goes down the further into COVID you get. But it is almost always the case that people are trying to do the right thing. I don't think people, go into medicine for reasons other than thinking it would be cool to help people. That sounds like a good idea. I don't think people go into science thinking that they're going to distribute propaganda. They go in thinking, hey, that's rather amazing that we have this set of rules that allow us to deduce really subtle things about the universe that turn out to be truly important. We all start out this way, and then something happens, right? Something that typically involves a system of incentives that is corrupting. And I do lose sympathy. As you are being corrupted and you are doing harm because you can't face the possibility of saying what you know, right? Especially if you're a doctor or you're a scientist on whom the public is depending to say the truth and to be candid about what we don't know, then at some point we get to get mad at you. But in general, I mean, look, I actually think that one of the most important things about my role in COVID was that I was too credulous at the beginning. I believed the story we were being told. And so what I hear from people who, many of whom were ahead of me in spotting what happened, is that waking up, that coming to realize that what I had been told was wrong, what I had backed was wrong, and reversing course in spite of the fact that that's personally difficult and embarrassing and painful was the right thing to do. That's important. And I guess I'm disappointed that so many people, once they realize, why is medicine not in rebellion against the forces that induced it to harm its own patients during COVID? Doctors and nurses in general now understand that there was something very wrong with the shots, that there were remedies that were useful that weren't made available. But what we don't hear is that chorus of doctors demanding change so that it can't happen again. I believe we are entitled to that, but I don't see them, and I'm now angry.
Let me ask Aaron and Craig, and just to your point, obviously, Bret, there's people on this call who see the world very differently when it comes to COVID vaccines than you do, but that's not what we're here to talk about. If you look at COVID through one lens, it's the government says there's an emergency and the rights and liberties of citizens have to take a back seat to mitigation efforts. If you look at the ICE operations, the government says there's an emergency and citizens of a city like Minneapolis, their rights and liberties have to take a back step to this law enforcement operation that's being churning through their city. So my question is, if you buy those lenses of both these events, wouldn't intellectual consistency demand you, if you were critical of what happened with the government in COVID, wouldn't you have to be critical of what's happening with the government today with these ICE operations? Aaron, what do you make of that formulation?
Well, I'll always sign up for being critical of the government. That's what I do best. Yeah, I mean, yes, there's some intellectual honesty to some of those things. I think the difference in many cases is, and at least in those particular two instances, is that you're battling between how does a society actually function amongst itself, and if you want to sort of have rules and laws and borders and these things and autonomous states that make decisions, then there are rules around those things. And I guess someone could make that argument about COVID, that really, that was a thing that we were all trying to be in it together or whatever we were going to do. I still come back to the idea that we're asking a fundamentally wrong question about what the role of government is in general in any of these instances, which is, how do we as people govern ourselves and have the autonomy where the individual is placed at the highest order of the pyramid? What we see often in this sort of collectivist society that we live in is that we have to make a decision that is the most plural decision and is the most available and valuable to the biggest plurality. And I don't think that that's right. And I actually don't think that that's really the framing of the founders. Their ideas, their intent was to sort of elevate the individual. And you can blame them for a lot of things, and you can call them wrong about a number of things, about all sorts of stuff that the 17th and 18th century was wrong about. But you can also look at that and say that that really is what this was intended. This experiment was intended to elevate the individual, to allow the individual the autonomy to make decisions about what was happening, and that there were certain things, and amongst those were sort of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that there's governments that are instituted amongst men to protect those things. I don't know how you reconcile what you do with a border and people that are a political association. That's what a state is. It's people who decide to be together because of their political unity, because of their political associations, and they form something and they say, this is what we think together, we're going to do this. If the defense of that requires some force, then I suppose that's what good government ultimately is to use the hand of government to do those things. I see COVID very differently because I feel like it wasn't necessarily a decision about the individual. It wasn't necessarily the decision about it was a march towards something in which we all had to agree that there was only one singular answer for a medical situation in which everyone's body's different. Everybody's stuff is going to look and feel different, respond different to different things, but there was one authoritarian response to it. And that was, I think that's where I part ways with that and the conversation around ICE.
Craig, what do you think about that? Looking at COVID and looking at this situation, I mean, COVID obviously infectious disease that one person spreads to another. Do you see this differently? I mean, you are part of the crew that took the heat, and it's all we've heard for the last year in this show is giving voice to people who felt very affronted by those mitigation efforts. And now we have this situation where a different crew feels very affronted by what they're seeing on the streets of Minneapolis. How do you reconcile those two?
Let me do that with a short disclaimer and then a couple replies to a couple things that have been said. The disclaimer is I worked in an emergency room in March 2020 and in April 2020. I saw more people die every day of COVID, not with COVID, whatever bullshit, like of COVID. Every single day, I saw people with oxygen saturations in double digits. It was horrible. It was the apocalypse. I walked into work and it was the apocalypse. That impacted me, obviously. I lost friends. Friends of mine died. But I also recognized in retrospect that clouded my view. I was in the worst place in this country, and I was about 3 months in, and I was like, oh, like I had to go back and check my own priors, recognizing that this was not the experience of everyone. But I saw over and over.
I just want
over
to
the
say
next
that's true for me too. That Craig and I were both in New York.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a very distinct context in which to have experienced COVID.
But I think you and I have also been able to like reflect back, and I think it's really, really, really hard to relitigate 2020 through the eyes of 2024, 2025, 2026, and to compare it to things like Minneapolis. But a couple of things that, we haven't talked about this, but the last time we chatted, Bret, you mentioned, ivermectin, and as someone that was on the front lines, we chatted about this with Pierre, this argument that we didn't use certain things because they didn't support big pharma. If anyone is listening to the show, I am not a big supporter of big pharma. But at the same time, we were using, prednisone, which truly cost pennies. Like that was the first life-saving medication. And so I try to figure out these inconsistencies behind the inconsistencies of the controversies or the criticisms lobbied at public health. And again, to your point, Bret, like in a complex system, the likelihood of unintended consequences is 100%. That being said, I look at this moment, and if I'm going to compare the two, I think what makes me the most angry is that we now have a federal government, particularly the health folks, who got into positions of power not because they were qualified to do so, but because they stood up and said things that I am grateful that they said, even if I disagreed. But what did Jay Bhattacharya do the day of the shooting, the day after the shooting? The guy who was all about government tyranny and about speaking out, he did not come out and say this is unacceptable. He did not even just stay silent. He spent all day shit posting the WHO. It's like, dude, it's not 2020. It's 2026. And if you want me to respect you, even if I disagree with you, I need you to be present in the moment. Talk about what's happening right now. Talk about government tyranny. If you don't see the parallels, then I'm concerned for you being in that position, particularly because that's what puts you there. So that's what upsets me. I think you can spend hours, looking into what Minneapolis and COVID look like, but those are the things that piss me off right now. Is that if you were against government, if you were against tyranny, if you were against it in 2020, if you're against it in 2021, I'm glad you spoke up. Great. Maybe I disagreed. But right now, we need you to speak up too.
Bret, what do you think about that?
Well, the first thing I think is I have not heard doctors say what you just said. And I can't tell you, I cannot describe emotionally how important it is to hear you say that you saw this terrifying stuff and that it put you in a frame of mind that you now realize was not like what others saw, that they were in a different place for a reason. And Rachel, I heard you go out of your way to chime in and agree to that too. That's really important. That is the first step. And anyway, I'm grateful to you for it. I also am resolutely against tyranny in any form. I don't necessarily think that everything that looks like tyranny is. In other words, if we go back to the example of why the ICE officers are masked, sure looks like tyranny, but there's a very good reason that you might be masked in that circumstance, and it has to do with protecting your identity because somebody's out to figure out who you are and to punish you privately. All right. So the fact that something looks like tyranny doesn't necessarily make it tyranny. But I agree with you. I'm shoulder to shoulder with you to the extent that any governmental force wants to engage in tyranny, especially domestically. I am resolutely against it. And I will say, I did support the election of Trump. I don't feel like I had a choice to vote for anybody else. I feel like what the Democratic Party proposed as an alternative was actually an insult to our intelligence. It was a dare. And so I would vote the same way again. But I would also point out that before I supported Trump's election, I was a supporter of Bobby Kennedy's. That's what I wanted to see. And there is a story here. You had this highly charismatic, articulate, highly intelligent person who wasn't just about MAHA. He had a proposal for how to do liberal governance correctly. And he was intolerable to the duopoly. As I said at the time, the duopoly feared RFK Jr. far more than it feared Trump. And we are now seeing exactly why. Trump can be lured into something in which people fall into their comfortable mindsets. It's very different with Bobby Kennedy. So in any case, yes, tyranny is avoiding it has to be something like our North Star. And it doesn't matter what the context is. It's intolerable in any context. And if I was convinced that what I was seeing on the streets of Minneapolis was tyranny, I would be in the very same place I was when tyranny clearly broke out during COVID. And I may yet be convinced of that, but I'm not. And I would, again, just point out there are many things influencing what we are seeing in Minneapolis that the public isn't even aware of, like the basic agreement of state and local governments to hand over illegal immigrants who show up in a legal context. In other words, somebody breaks the law and they are an illegal alien and they get handed over to ICE without any confrontation on the street, without ICE having to bust down anybody's door. And at the point that state and local governments decide they're not going to do that, what they're effectively saying is we'd like a little tyranny because, you know, there's not enough on our screens to make our case.
I have a question for both of you, Aaron and Bret, because you've both talked about your support for Kennedy, and you both made a point to say that, you know, your support was not only rooted in the MAHA piece of the Kennedy platform. And as somebody who pays a lot of attention to Kennedy and has been for a while as a political actor, like as somebody who I think has ideas that go well beyond the health realm, I agree with you. He has sort of a long track record on anti-corporate stuff well beyond health. He has a long track record on sort of talking about establishment interests the way that you both are here. He has really strong feelings about speech, right? You know, and freedom of speech. So given all of that, and given Minneapolis, with the caveats, Bret, that you maybe are not convinced yet that Minneapolis for you resonates as being as critical a crisis as it resonates for me as. I'm wondering how you are both thinking now about the compromise that was made to get Bobby the job he has now by, you know, pairing up with MAGA, and how you think about the future of that relationship. Because for me, as somebody who pays a lot of attention to Bobby and his politics and his long history of activism and outspokenness, I would love to know if either of you know, like, I would love to know what Bobby's thinking about what's happening in Minneapolis, because to me, it registers as the kind of thing where I certainly 5 or 10 years ago, Bobby Kennedy, I think, would have been vocally against what he's seeing. I'm interested to know if that's where he is now, but I'm also more than that interested to know where you two both are about this complicated, sort of uneasy political alliance that I see maybe not fracturing in this moment, but certainly threatened by what's going on.
Brett, I'd love for you to weigh in. I have the same question.
Well, I don't know what Kennedy is thinking about Minneapolis. I'd be very curious to have that conversation with him. I'm not sure how at liberty he is to have that conversation because of the delicate political alliance that he is in. But I will say the Trump administration, the GOP, MAGA, and MAHA are a coalition. That coalition is not fully aligned on values or policy. And I think it is especially true because Trump's orientation to the world is as a negotiator, that everything is viewed through the lens of trades, which in some places is actually exactly right, and it's kind of a relief. And in other places, it's perfectly horrifying. Things that should not be tradable at all are treated as, just another commodity. So one of the things that I hope happens is that the recognition that Kennedy resonates for a reason, because there are a great many of us who are politically homeless. The fact that the Democratic Party drove Kennedy and Gabbard out, like the last two likable people in the party, as far as I can tell, were driven out. These people would rather have their apparatchiks and their machine politicians than have charismatic, independent people who give voice to something that the public is hungry to hear voiced. That tells you where we are. And I'm just waiting for something to recognize we can't have a cult of personality around a guy like Trump. That's not going to work. It certainly can't work long term. What we need is a party that simply speaks for our interests and the values that we do share, and that is ready to be hard-headed about policy. It's great to be compassionate, but a compassionate policy requires a dispassionate analysis. We can't all be jerked around by our heartstrings, because what we will end up doing is doing things that sound good that don't work. And anyway, the pent-up demand for this is through the roof. Most of us are politically homeless. Most people don't want to be in the corrupt Republican Party or the corrupt Democratic Party. They want a party that is simply trying to do the right thing and tells them what that is.
Brett, sorry to put you on the spot about it, but when you hear Stephen Miller on Fox News, what's your reaction?
I don't watch Fox News. I certainly hear a lot of stuff that strikes me as posturing, bravado, playing to particular constituencies. Look, I hate politics. I really don't like it. Politics at best is a necessary evil. What I want are people who are actually about what they say they're about. Kennedy being a great example. And I think there are many of them, but most of them have been driven out of the political sphere because it's just too toxic. You can't, as it is very difficult to survive in science as somebody who simply wants to use the method to discover what's true, irrespective of whose interests are harmed. You can't survive that way in science, and it's very hard to survive in anywhere in or around governance if you're not willing to play the game. And that explains why you won't have to go very far to find cynical people throughout that structure.
Can I just ask one quick question, then I'd love to hear Aaron to close this up. I would be, I guess, really concerned and maybe confused if I was Bobby Kennedy or MAHA right now. You just said that we can't have a cult of personality around Trump, but what would happen to MAHA if RFK Jr. stood up right now and spoke out about what's happening in Minnesota? What would happen if he's gone as the titular figurehead? And I talk to folks, my friends, family, people that are MAHA, MAGA, some that are one, not the other. And I wonder, what does the future even look like? Like, is this a moment, if this is truly an inflection point, as many of us agreed at the beginning of this call, and MAHA does not come out, says we're at the top of this, we finally have this moment, let's not screw it up by talking about things that aren't health, but continues to align itself with what could be a sinking ship around immigration policy, around ICE, etc. Like, what does this mean for MAHA going forward? Is this the death knell of a movement that you both have worked so hard to build up? What comes after? And I don't think this is a question that you need to answer now, but I just keep coming back to this in my conversations with folks in MAHA that seem like we don't know what to do right now. Do we speak out? Is this a moment where we like find traction outside of just health that we can be seen as that political movement and get more credence and buy-in from a bigger part of the population that feel homeless in both of these parties? Or is this just like, let's cross our fingers, let's hope for the best and pretend this coalition is going to keep working for the near and long-term future?
Who wants to take that?
I'd love to hear Aaron.
Let's go Aaron and then Bret.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, politics is, I'm with Bret. It's messy. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes odd bedfellows. And it's all just sort of horse trading pragmatism at the point in the government that we have. And those horse trades are really for other things besides the betterment of the citizen. They're often just much more about how to remain in power or how to continue to keep the apparatus moving, or to Bret's point about the Democratic Party, let's just make the machine continue to go. I think that's those are real things. I think there's real troubles within the system. And I also don't know that it gives someone a lot of flexibility. One of the things that Kennedy said in his concession or sort of suspension speech of his stuff was that he had talked with Donald Trump about the opportunity to disagree about the policies that he disagreed with. I haven't seen a ton of that. And I don't know if that's just a matter of, as you say, Craig, put your head down and kind of keep working on the things that you are seeing success in. Don't rock the boat so that you can continue to make some strides and some success. I think from the cabinet positions that were appointed, I think Kennedy has, whether you like what he's done or not, he's made the most progress within a bureaucratic system. There actually have been things that were tangible outcomes of what he's done. And I think that that's something that I do admire about him, which is, maybe at the moment I would like to say something, but the work I'm doing is the task that I've been given, and I'm at hand to do it. And so I'm going to continue to put my head down and move in that direction. Would I like him to disagree with Trump about a number of things? I would love it if he would. I wish there was a more robust debate within government. I wish there was, sort of a Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian debate about what's the role of government and how do we do this and what actually goes on. I wish that really did happen within an administration. But I'm not sure that that's the politics system we have. We have a very monolithic deal. And, I think he knows well enough too, that if he does enough speaking out, it doesn't take Trump long to be on the wrong side of him. You could look at Marjorie Taylor Greene. You could look at Thomas Massey. You could look at Rand Paul. You could look at the people who do say things that I tend to agree with about the world and the situation that we find ourselves in, and they're ceremoniously bounced off the bus pretty quickly. So I think that's maybe a calculated position by RFK to sort of stay working and functioning and making something happen that he is seeing some progress in. Do I hope that MAHA becomes a coalition or some sort of form of a new party? Maybe. I think it's got a lot of legs around it that could. But I also think, I'm not sure we're going to find a solution within this sort of construct that we live within. I think it's going to have to be bigger questions. I think it's going to have to be not just a third party. I think it's going to have to be, how do you unify around some principles that we have around what we think government's role is? And if we can sort of get back to that conversation, then I think you can actually get to a discussion about who can lead that. Which charismatic figure will be the voice that can help you lead that sort of coalition around things. You could look at the Libertarian Party. They've been at work for a long time, and they're a classic example of somebody that as they fight with amongst each other, they never actually progress and never see anything actually happen, because all they do is, voice their concerns around the principles, and there's no charismatic leader to lead them out of that wilderness. So I think he's doing smart things if you want to be political and stay in business and kind of continue to do what you're doing. But I'd love more discussions, because I'm with most of us, I think, on this call would say I'm probably more independent minded than anything. I don't like the Republican Party at all. I don't like the Democratic Party at all. I don't like the sort of this kind of weird amalgamation of power that surrounds persona. I'm not into that, but it's what we have. So if we can make progress within that, sort of cut your arm off 1 inch at a time to make some progress, I suppose that's okay.
Hey, Bret, take us home.
All right. I'm going to keep harping on this because I think you're leading the way here. This conversation has involved profound disagreements over a highly volatile issue that is very immediate, a still developing situation. And yet, I think for the second time on your program, I've experienced a sense that we are aligned in wanting good things to emerge, even if we disagree about the facts of what we're seeing or how to get to a better place. So that feels great. In the very few places that I see that same spirit being cultivated, it always feels great. It's a huge relief from the thing that happens normally if you just go to your feed and watch people tearing each other apart over disagreements over facts or ideas or whatever it might be. So I think if most people had that available to them as an option, if there was somewhere they could go and they could step back into a prior mode where we don't treat the opponent as evil, we treat them as the loyal opposition who wants good things and disagrees with us, that everybody would have just a sense that the world was maybe better and more hopeful than we get the idea it is each and every day. I'm not wildly hopeful about a third party, not because we don't need one, but because the system is built to prevent that from happening. And so I don't know how we get there. And I've tried a number of things. I did Unity 2020 back in the 2020 election. I was one of the leaders of Rescue the Republic in the most recent presidential election. So I know that unity is the answer. I know that it's not nearly as hard as people imagine it is. If you can just simply carve out enough space to safely say the things on which we agree on before you get to talking about the things that we don't yet agree on, people like it and they want more of it. And so the room for a third party exists. The potential for it does not seem to. But there is a step short of that party which we can't build for structural reasons, and that is a movement. All of us who feel politically homeless, and frankly, anybody paying attention should feel politically homeless. Neither of these parties speak for us. They just simply don't. They're about something else, and it doesn't much matter what that something else is. As soon as you know that these parties pander to you in order to get your vote, and then they do some other thing for some other reason, and the answer is, well, that's not my party, and there's no reason that I should be cheering for the people wearing that jersey. So what we need is a galvanizing movement, not a phony movement, but one that recognizes how much we have to gain by having conversations that cross these bridges, whether they are on fire or not. And ultimately, I'll just borrow from the facts of evolution. What really brings cells together, organisms together, or people together is shared fate. Once you realize that that other person is going down with the same ship, then you have every reason to collaborate on figuring out how to keep the ship afloat. And that's where we are. So anyway, good on you for setting up discussions that bring this out so easily. You're picking the right people and you're setting the topics in motion in the right way. And I really appreciate that. And thanks for letting me participate in it.
Brett, I think I'm hearing you say that we're all going down on the ship together. So let's join the revolution and make a movement of it. I just want to thank all of you for joining us on this discussion. I think this is just the beginning. Like, let's have more of these. I think just the act of having these conversations, there's something just deeply meaningful to me. I want to thank Aaron Everitt, Dr. Rachael Bedard, Dr. Craig Spencer, and Dr. Bret Weinstein for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you.
Thanks.
This was awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
It was great.
That is our show for this week. Please send us questions and comments at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. I am Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. She's Maggie Bartlett. He is Dr. Mark. And we'll see you right back here next week.